Language is so ordinary that most people never stop to think about how strange it actually is. Right now, sounds are leaving your mouth and landing inside someone else's mind as meaning, not just noise. Meaning. That's not a small thing. Every word you've ever said, every argument, every joke, every time someone told you they loved you, all of it runs on a system so complex that the world's most powerful computers still can't fully replicate it. And we invented it. Not in a lab, not with a plan, not because someone sat down and decided to. It just happened. The question is how. And the honest answer is that nobody completely knows. But what scientists do know is surprising enough that the real story is worth telling properly. Let's start with the basic problem. Language doesn't leave bones. Tools do. Fire does, in the form of ash and charred remains. Even some behaviors leave traces in the archaeological record. But the moment the first human opened their mouth and made a sound that meant something specific to another person, that moment left nothing behind. It dissolved into the air. So when researchers try to figure out when and how language appeared, they're working backwards from clues that aren't always obvious. They're looking at skull shapes, throat anatomy, genetic mutations, and stone tools, trying to reconstruct something invisible from things that aren't language at all. It's a bit like trying to figure out what a song sounded like by examining only the stage it was performed on. Here's what the anatomy tells us. Modern spoken language requires a very specific set of physical equipment. You need a larynx positioned low in the throat, a tongue capable of fine-grained movement, and precise neural control over your breathing. Most other primates have none of this. A chimpanzee's larynx sits high in the throat, which actually lets them breathe and swallow at the same time, useful for an animal that eats quickly in competitive environments. But that same anatomy makes complex speech physically impossible. Somewhere in hominin evolution, the larynx descended. That descent cost us the ability to safely eat and breathe simultaneously, which is why humans choke on food in a way that other great apes basically don't. Language cost us something real. The fact that we paid that price anyway suggests the payoff was enormous. The gene that gets the most attention when it comes to language is called FOXP2. It showed up in genetic research in the late 1990s when scientists studying a British family found that members who had a mutated version of the gene struggled severely with grammar and the fine motor control needed for speech. When researchers later sequenced Neanderthal DNA, they found that Neanderthals carried the same version of FOXP2 that modern humans do. That's important. It's a clue that Neanderthals may have had at least some of the biological capacity for language, but having the hardware doesn't mean running the software. A piano doesn't make music by itself. The presence of FOXP2 in Neanderthals tells us they could have had language. It doesn't tell us they did. Now, let's talk about what the fossil record actually gives us. The hyoid bone sits in the throat and anchors the muscles involved in speech. It's small, delicate, and rarely preserved. But one was found at a Neanderthal site in Israel, at a place called Kibara Cave, dating back roughly 60,000 years. Its shape is nearly identical to the hyoid bone in modern humans. Another was found more recently from a Neanderthal site in Spain. Both suggest the physical structures for spoken language were in place. What we can't say is whether those structures were being used for full, complex language or something simpler. The anatomy was there. What happened with it is harder to pin down. The oldest potential evidence of symbolic thinking, the kind of thinking that language almost certainly requires, goes back further than most people expect. In a cave in South Africa called Blombos, researchers found pieces of ochre engraved with geometric patterns dating to around 75,000 years ago. Ochre is a red mineral pigment, and those engravings weren't functional. They weren't tools. They appear to be purely symbolic, which means the people who made them were capable of attaching meaning to something abstract. That's a mental step that sits very close to language. At roughly the same site, researchers also found shell beads that had clearly been strung and worn, which means they were being used to communicate something about the person wearing them. Identity, status, group membership. That's language logic, even without words. The question that keeps coming up is whether language appeared suddenly or built up slowly over hundreds of thousands of years. This is one of the most contested debates in all of human evolutionary science. On one side are researchers who argue for what's sometimes called a big bang of language, a rapid emergence sometime around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, possibly linked to a genetic mutation that rewired how the brain processed and generated symbols. The evidence for this view is the explosion of complex behavior that shows up in the archaeological record around that time. Sophisticated artwork, long-distance trade in materials, elaborate burial practices, musical instruments made from bone. All of it arrives in what feels like a burst. On the other side are researchers who point to evidence that many of these behaviors go back much further. The Blombos ochre is 75,000 years old. A cave in Morocco called Jebel Irhad produced human remains pushing back to around 300,000 years ago, with tools sophisticated enough to suggest planning and coordination. Some researchers argue that language evolved gradually alongside these capabilities, not in a single leap. The honest position is that both camps have evidence, both camps have gaps, and the actual emergence of language probably wasn't a clean event with a clear before and after. It was messier than that. Let's talk about what may have actually driven language to develop. Survival is the obvious answer, but it's probably not the complete one. Yes, being able to say there's a predator near the water is more efficient than any gesture. Coordinating a hunt gets easier with words. Passing on knowledge about which plants are edible, where to find water during dry months, how to work a particular stone. All of that becomes dramatically more powerful once you can describe it out loud and in detail. But some researchers think social pressure may have been just as important as survival pressure. Living in large groups requires managing relationships. Who to trust, who to avoid, what happened between two other people yesterday. Gossip, essentially. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar has argued that language may have evolved partly as a kind of vocal grooming, a way to maintain social bonds across groups too large for physical grooming alone to hold together. Here's where it gets interesting. Dunbar's research suggests that human social groups naturally stabilize around 150 people. That number keeps appearing across hunter-gatherer societies, military units, and even modern organizations. Below that number, people generally know each other well enough to cooperate without formal structures. Above it, things start to fragment. Dunbar argues that language is what made that 150-person group possible in the first place, because it let people track relationships, share information about others, and build trust at a scale that would have been impossible through one-on-one interaction alone. If he's right, then language wasn't just a communication tool, it was the social infrastructure that made large-scale human cooperation possible at all. The relationship between language and thought is one of the oldest philosophical questions attached to this subject, and it's still not resolved. Does language shape the way we think, or does it just describe thoughts we'd have anyway? There's evidence on both sides. Speakers of languages with different color term boundaries perceive color distinctions slightly differently. Some languages encode spatial relationships in ways that affect how speakers orient themselves in space. The Pirahan people of the Amazon, whose language has fascinated and divided linguists for decades, have no numbers beyond 1 and 2, and their speakers show very different numerical reasoning patterns than speakers of languages with full counting systems. Whether that's caused by the language or reflected in it is still being argued. But the connection between language structure and thought structure seems real enough to take seriously. Writing is where the record gets much clearer. The earliest confirmed writing systems date to around 3200 BCE in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians developed a script called cuneiform, pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets to track grain, livestock, and trade goods. The Egyptians developed hieroglyphics at roughly the same time. Early writing wasn't poetry, it was accounting. The first things humans decided were worth writing down weren't stories or prayers, but inventories. How many jars of oil? How many sheep? Who owed what to whom? That tells you something real about what was valuable enough to preserve at that moment in history. Language itself is almost certainly tens of thousands of years older, but writing is what finally made language permanent. In China, the oldest confirmed writing appears around 1200 BCE in the form of oracle bone script, characters carved into turtle shells and ox bones and used for divination. The Mesoamerican writing systems, including Mayan script, which is among the most sophisticated ever developed, emerged independently, with no connection to the systems in the Middle East or East Asia. The same basic drive kept producing the same basic solution in completely separate parts of the world. That's not a coincidence, that's a need. What's remarkable about Mayan writing is how complete it was. It could represent every aspect of spoken language, including sounds, grammar, and complex meaning. When researchers finally cracked the code in the 20th century, they found detailed historical records, astronomical calculations, and narratives of rulers and wars spanning centuries. A writing system developed without any contact with Europe or Asia had arrived at something functionally equivalent in almost every important way. That independent invention is one of the stronger arguments that language and the urge to record it aren't cultural accidents. There's something deeper in how human minds work. Sign languages deserve a place in this story because they reveal something important about what language actually is. When communities of deaf people come together, they don't just borrow from spoken language and translate it into gesture. They develop fully independent languages with their own grammar, syntax, and structure, and they do it quickly. Nicaraguan Sign Language is the most documented example. In the 1980s, a school for deaf children in Managua brought together children who had previously been isolated, communicating only in rough homemade gestures with their own families. Within a generation, the children had created a fully structured language from scratch. The second generation refined it further. Linguists who studied the process watched a language being born in real time. It wasn't taught, it emerged. That suggests the capacity for language isn't tied to any specific channel. It runs on something more fundamental than sound. Some of the most productive research in recent decades has come from studying language acquisition in children. Children don't learn language the way they learn to ride a bicycle, through repeated instruction and deliberate practice. They absorb it. By the time most children are 4 years old, they've internalized a grammar system complex enough that no computer program can fully replicate it, and they did it without a single grammar lesson. The linguist Noam Chomsky argued decades ago that humans must be born with some kind of built-in language acquisition device, a mental structure that's ready to receive and organize linguistic input from birth. The specifics of that theory are still debated fiercely. But the speed and universality of language acquisition across every culture on Earth is hard to explain without assuming that something in the brain is specifically prepared for it. What did the earliest language actually sound like? This is almost completely unrecoverable. Some researchers have tried to reconstruct proto-languages by tracing shared roots across language families. Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor of languages from English to Hindi to Russian, has been partially reconstructed from patterns in its descendant languages. A few candidate words have been proposed as extremely ancient, surviving in some form across multiple unrelated language families. Words like mama and dada appear in languages with almost no shared history, which some researchers attribute to the mouth movements infants make naturally. But these are fragments at best. The first words ever spoken are gone. Whatever they meant, whoever said them, the moment is irretrievable. What we can say is that by the time Homo sapiens were moving out of Africa in large numbers, roughly 70,000 years ago, language was almost certainly already a central part of how they lived. The evidence of symbolic behavior, long-distance trade networks, and coordinated group strategies all point to a species that wasn't just communicating but planning, negotiating, and sharing knowledge across time and distance. The groups that left Africa carried their language with them. As they spread into Europe, Asia, Australia, and eventually the Americas, their languages diverged and multiplied. Today, there are roughly 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Every one of them traces back, through branching chains of change and separation, to an origin that most researchers place in Africa tens of thousands of years ago. The diversity of those 7,000 languages is staggering. Some have click consonants that most humans literally cannot produce without years of practice. Some encode time and tense in completely different ways than European languages do. Some rely heavily on tone, where the same syllable means entirely different things depending on its pitch. Papua New Guinea alone, an island roughly the size of California, is home to over 800 distinct languages. That level of diversity accumulated because language changes faster than almost any other human system. Within a few generations of separation, dialects emerge. Within centuries, those dialects become mutually unintelligible. The process has been running continuously for somewhere between 50,000 and 300,000 years, depending on when language actually started. The 7,000 languages alive today are what that process looks like from the inside. Most of those 7,000 languages are in serious danger. Linguists estimate that about half of the world's current languages could disappear within a century, as smaller communities shift to dominant regional languages for economic and social reasons. When a language disappears, it doesn't just lose its words. It takes with it a particular way of categorizing the world, a set of concepts that may not map cleanly onto any other language, and in some cases, knowledge encoded in vocabulary and oral tradition that exists nowhere else. The Yawanapi people of the Amazon have plant names in their language that describe medicinal properties Western science hasn't documented yet. Some of those languages have no writing system. When the last speaker goes, that knowledge goes with them, entirely and permanently.